My great-grandfather John was the closest thing to a ghost I'd ever seen. He was very much alive, at least in the physical sense, but there was a sense of death and sadness that seemed to haunt him. Even as a child, I was attuned to it. On the sunniest days, he hid in the shadows. In the times of happiness and laughter, his face was full of agony and despair. He never showed much interest in me or my mother's mother, who was his daughter June, or my mother's mother's mother. That would be his wife, my great-grandmother Cora. He showed so little interest in the matter, in fact, that when he awoke a few years ago to discover my great-grandmother Cora deceased beside him in bed, he left her there while he ate a breakfast of toast and coffee. Only after he had finished his breakfast and dressed for the day did he pull out the yellow pages to phone the morgue, requesting they send someone around when they had the chance to sort this mess out. Instead, the police came. They asked my great-grandfather John a lot of questions, and they had a look around the house. At the end of their investigation, though, they determined that my great-grandmother had died in her sleep from natural causes. And the only thing my great-grandfather was guilty of was having a cold heart. My great-grandfather John came to live with us after that, because as my mother put it, where else could he go? The arrangement only lasted a year. I was a senior in high school at the time, and I remember seeing my great-grandfather's presence in my home as an invasion. I hated how my mother made us act differently around him. Made us pretend that we were refined and polite, when really, we were the sort of dysfunctional family that communicated with slam doors and explicitives. I don't want your great-grandfather to think that all you do is play video games, she said as she unplugged my PlayStation from the downstairs TV, boxing it up and instructing me to keep it hidden in my room. She replaced it with a stack of books that none of us had read. Classics like Moby Dick and Robinson Crusoe. My mother also cleaned off our dining room table, which for years had served as a dumping ground for random trinkets and clutter. Everything from elementary school art projects to delinquent credit card bills. We're going to have a home-cooked meal together every night, like a family, she insisted. The charade only lasted for a few weeks. A few weeks of my mother smiling tensely in forced conversation, my father and I scowling impatiently, and my great-grandfather John ignoring us all, lost in his own world, before my mother finally realized it was a lost cause and gave up. After that, my great-grandfather mostly kept to himself. He went to bed at 7 every night, locking himself into his bedroom. When he moved in, he installed a deadbolt on his door. His door would remain the following morning. He wouldn't come out until we were all gone. My parents at work, and he at school. What he did during the day, I still to this day have no clue. All my life, I had known my great-grandfather John as a quiet and reclusive man. As I got older, I decided that the way he treated his family made him a cruel and selfish man. My opinion of my great-grandfather changed one night, during the year he lived with us, what would turn out to be the last year of his life. My parents were celebrating their anniversary with an impromptu trip to the coast. They had long given up on their marriage and on enjoying each other's company. A poorly planned trip to a deserted beach town, gray with winter and shuttered for the off-season, was the final nail in the coffin. They announced their plans to a divorce a few months later. The trip left me alone with my great-grandfather for a week, and I enjoyed most of that time ignoring my curfew and playing my PlayStation on the downstairs TV. One night, I was sitting downstairs doing my homework at the dining room table, which again had become littered with life debris, when I heard the deadbolt on my great-grandfather's bedroom door unlatch, followed by his soft footsteps moving down the stairs. This was hours after his usual 7 p.m. bedtime, so I was curious what had brought him out of bed. A snack? A drink? Some fresh air? In the months that we had lived together, I had learned not to bother greeting my great-grandfather. He rarely acknowledged me anyways. So that night, I was shocked when he padded over and took a seat directly across from me at the table, clearing a spot for his hands to rest. "I'm going to die soon," he told me, looking me square in the eye, "and I need to tell you something before I go." He had already had my full attention, But I was so intrigued that I closed my textbook and pushed my homework away. Don't interrupt, he instructed. Don't speak until I've finished. I nodded my acceptance of his terms, and then he began. I was born in the Philippines, in what you would probably call a straw hut, he said. My mother had already decided for me that I was going to be American. I wasn't allowed to learn Tagalog, only American English. My mother only spoke to me using the very broken bit of English that she knew. My only source of conversation and companionship came from the radio. She had it tuned to a station that had broadcast in English, and she would sit me down, instructing me to listen. Sometimes she'd repeat the English phrase she heard, to make sure I was listening. But neither of us spoke English, and neither of us knew what the sounds and syllables coming out of the radio meant. Listening to my great-grandfather speak was strange for several reasons. First, in the span of 2 minutes, he had already said more to me than he had my entire life. Second, because the way he spoke, it sounded like he was reading a story from a book or reciting something from memory. Every word seemed carefully chosen, carefully crafted together. When I was old enough to be useful, my mother gave all the money she had to a fisherman who promised to take me to America. I'm not sure what she hoped would happen once I got there. I was just a scrawny boy with brown skin. I didn't speak, and I didn't seem to listen either. Anyone that saw me would have assumed I was deficient. The fisherman took me to sea. It was months before I saw land again, but luckily I didn't know what time was back then. The fisherman was a talkative man, and he insisted on speaking to me, whether I understood him or not. He taught me the names of all the different parts of his ship, the tools he used, the fish we caught. Once I had learned those words, he taught me about the stars in the sky, and how I would never get lost as long as I remembered where they were. He taught me the names of the fish we caught, and the legends about the monsters that lived in the sea. The fisherman taught me a great many things, and when he kept his promise to my mother and brought me to America, I decided he was a good man. We arrived in Alaska, and no sooner had my feet touched the dock in Ketchikan, he offered me a job on his boat. He paid me better than he needed to, better than the other brown boys who were shuttled over on crowded boats and made to work in factories. And he let me rent a room in his house with a cot to sleep on and a hot meal each night. He charged me a fair rent for the room, which he deducted from my wages every month. Our arrangement taught me 2 new words: integrity and respect. A man of integrity always pays his own way, he told me. He explained that he charged me rent out of respect for my integrity. We spent a lot of time at sea. Sometimes there were storms, and the sky would rain sharp shards of ice, and the sea would rock with massive waves, reminding us of how tiny we were. Other times, when the sea was smooth and the sky clear, the crew would remedy boredom with spirits and other exotic spoils that they had required in their travels. When they had drowned their sorrows in these spirits and smoked pipes filled with their funny grass, and their eyes were glassy and their cheeks red, they'd tell stories. You can imagine the sort of stories. Legends of lost treasure, of pirates, of sea monsters and mermaids. Always the same sort of thing. One night, it was just the fisherman and I, and he started to tell me one of his stories. I usually liked his best, but the one he told that night chilled me to the bone. The legend of the Salt Woman. My great-grandfather paused. As he told me his story, he had sat with his eyes cast down and his hands folded on the table in front of him. When he stopped, he looked up at me. It struck me that this was the first time I had really seen my great-grandfather. The lines and wrinkles worn on his face, the brown that had faded from his skin, the bottomless blackness of his eyes. He continued. According to the legend, the fisherman said, hers was a beauty that changed form to suit the eye of the beholder. She was a shapeshifter, and she transformed to fulfill the deepest desires of whoever looked upon her. A man liked red hair and pale skin. When he saw her, he'd see hair as red as strawberries, and skin so milky he could lap it up. This was the most animated I had ever seen the fisherman, so I asked him, have you met this woman? His smile faded and he said, I have. So I asked the fisherman what she looked like when he saw her. He said, why, she had hair as red as strawberries and skin so milky I could lap it up. I laughed, but he didn't. So I asked him what happened when he met this red-haired woman of his dreams. The salt woman is a jealous god, he explained. Once you've seen her beauty, it's your curse to love her forever. If you reject the salt woman, she will shift into her original form, to something demonic and hideous. She's a devil in disguise, and once you've seen her for who she truly is, the legend says you'll turn to salt. A fisherman's first love is the sea, the fisherman said. When the salt woman realized that I had betrayed her by loving something more than I loved her, she began to shift before my eyes. I asked the fisherman how he had been spared of the salt woman's horrible punishment. He told me that he shut his eyes and ran, blindly. Unfortunately for the fisherman, though, the salt woman can't be outsmarted. She follows those who betray her. She haunts them. The salt woman stalks them, lurking in every shadow and hiding in every dark corner. It becomes her game, and it's excruciating. But in the end, she always wins. My great-grandfather was still looking at me, this grave expression filling his face. I kept my promise not to interrupt, and waited for him to continue. I stayed with the fisherman for several years, he said finally, until his skin turned pale gray and he started coughing up blood. I wasn't sure what was going to be the death of him, the salt woman from his story, or the cancer festering in his lungs. Ultimately, he wasn't willing to die at the hands of either. One clear winter night, while we were out at sea, he jumped from the ship and into the black water below. I suppose if you believe the legend of the salt woman, you'd say he won. After the fisherman died, I decided to start my own company. The fisherman had left me his boat and a small sum of money, in addition to a wealth of invaluable skills and knowledge. I established myself in Alaska and got a place of my own in Ketchikan. I sent some money to the Philippines, along with letters and packages, but these were all eventually returned to me. No explanation, just return to sender. One problem that couldn't be cured with money or success was loneliness, my great-grandfather said. Without the fisherman around, I was fiercely lonely. The other men in town had a tendency to keep company with the loose moral harlots that slunk around flaunting their flesh, like their bosoms were a kind of wealth. I remembered the story of the fisherman, though, and avoided these temptations. Instead, I went to Mass, and that's where I met a woman named Beth. She was modest and ordinary in every sense of those words, but she was kind and loyal. Like me, she was a transplant in Alaska. And like me, she found that the only thing colder than a winter day is the bitterness of being alone. After a brief courtship, we married. By the end of that year, she was with child. A mixture of excitement and pride burned in my cheeks. I hadn't known that my great-grandfather had been married before Cora. I felt honored, like he had selected me to be his confidant. I wondered who else had been trusted with this privileged information. You probably don't need me to remind you, my great-grandfather said, that it was quite controversial for a brown man to marry a white woman, even in Alaska. I was a brown Filipino. She was a white Russian. Those things don't mix, and our union was something of a controversy, even to the locals who looked at me with a measure of respect. But Beth didn't care about what the gossip or the cruel things that the other wives in town whispered to each other when she walked by. She didn't care about the color of my skin. She didn't care that our child would be brown, like me. Our son was born with a head of dense black hair that stood up straight. He had my nose, pressed flat against his face, and the same ivory skin and constellation of ginger freckles as his mother. Beth named him John, after me. I thought it was an honor I hadn't yet earned, but she insisted. Things got hard after the baby. There never seemed to be enough money. We never seemed to get enough sleep. I worked harder than ever before. I was never home, always at sea. I'd dock in strange new cities where I was surrounded by strange faces I didn't recognize. This next part I'm ashamed of, my great-grandfather said. There's no excuse, no amount of loneliness or desperation. The fisherman taught me about the word integrity, and since then, I've learned that integrity means being able to admit what you've done wrong. The fisherman also taught me about the salt woman, but even his warning couldn't save me from my own foolish humanity. My great-grandfather had cast his eyes down again. He was staring at the table, at his hands, as if there were dirt beneath his fingernails that he wanted gone. I was lonely when I met her, he said. She was the prettiest thing I had ever laid eyes on, just like the fisherman said. Brown skin the color of molasses. After months trapped with the stench of fish and sea, she smelled like lavender. I don't need to tell you the details, he said. Suffice it to say, I was drunk. Drunk on her charm, her beauty, and drunk on the cheap spirits of an Alaskan fishing town. I was unfaithful that night. I awoke before the sun the next morning, and I saw her sleeping beside me in a bed I didn't recognize, in a home that wasn't my own. I was horrified by what I'd done, and the warning of the fisherman came to me. If this was the salt woman laying beside me, I would no doubt fall prey to her wrath when she awoke and learned that I intend to return to my Beth. I decided to flee before she awoke. I ran. Once I'd made it to the docks, I boarded my ship and woke the crew so we could set sail. I didn't feel at ease out at sea. The disgust I felt tormented me, and I felt the wrath of the salt woman following me, like the wake we left in the ocean. I knew I hadn't outsmarted her, and it was only a matter of time before her punishment came. When we arrived back to Ketchikan, I was reluctant to return home to Beth. I had already made up my mind that I wasn't going to tell her. What good would it do? It would only hurt her, and the curse of the salt woman was my burden to bear, and my burden alone. Nothing could have prepared me for what awaited when I returned home. My great-grandfather had stopped talking, and I realized how long we had been sitting there. I wonder if it was hard on him, if he needed to take a break. Beth was waiting for me, he said. She held our lifeless son in her arms. He tingled like a toy, and I knew he was deceased. He was dripping wet. She had drowned him. I tried to take him from her, but she wouldn't let me. I shouted at her, my guilt replaced with anger and hurt. That's when I saw it. The pieces of her face were like pieces to a puzzle, cracking and shifting and falling away. Underneath, she burned black. Her face was melting, losing its shape. My body responded before my brain had figured it out, and I turned my back. I ran for the door, and I heard her body disintegrate behind me, shattering and crinkling like the little shards of glass scattering over the hardwood floor of our home. I kept my eyes shut, following the road outside of my memory. I wanted to look back, wanted to see my wife and son, but I knew they were no longer there. Beth was the salt woman. The fisherman told me that the salt woman would assume the shape of your deepest desires. I foolishly thought that meant beauty. But for me, the salt woman became the very thing that my heart longed for most. Loyalty, family, a loving mother. The salt woman exploits any brand of vulnerability or loneliness. What happened? I asked breathlessly, forgetting my promise not to interrupt. My great-grandfather didn't seem annoyed. His hands rose from the table for the first time and he rubbed his temples. She hasn't left me since that day, he said. Just like the fisherman warned me, she has haunted me endlessly. Everywhere I go, I feel her presence. I hear the cries of our infant son. I know she's coming for me. I can feel it. We sat in silence, the story dissolving in my mind like a cube of sugar dropping in hot tea, furling and unfolding. Then my great-grandfather excused himself. It was long after midnight, and he said he needed to get some rest. He stopped at the foot of the stairs and slapped my back with the palm of his hand. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. I didn't sleep a wink that night. My mind was racing with questions I wanted to ask, details that I needed to clarify. A few times I was tempted to walk down the hall and hammer on his door, to wake him up and ask, That's how desperately I wanted to know more. But I didn't. It could wait until the morning, I reasoned with myself. That night would be the last time I ever saw my great-grandfather. The police reports say he went missing from his bed. That's the official explanation. But I know better. When my parents returned home the next morning, they found his door unlocked. They pushed it open to discover that he was indeed missing from his bed. In his place, there was a pile of salt. In the years that followed my great-grandfather's death, I was profoundly disturbed by the stories he told me. The legend became so ingrained in me that I followed my great-grandfather's footsteps to Ketchikan and asked around about the legend. It took me a while before I found someone willing to talk to me, but they told me the story. It matched my great-grandfather's rendition, almost word for word. There was only one detail that my great-grandfather had left out. The curse doesn't strike randomly. It's passed on by the men that survived the Salt Woman. When they tell the legend, it spreads the curse. It selects the Salt Woman's next victim. Like a disease. If that's true, then that means the fisherman passed the curse to my great-grandfather when he told him the story. And when my great-grandfather told me the story that night at my parents' dining room table, then I stopped typing. I looked up across the bedroom to my beautiful wife, asleep in our bed. No, that part of the legend can't be true, right?